Welcome to Whispers of the Night. Tonight we journey to in 1936, where a wealthy widow dies atop treacherous cliffs. What seems like an accident becomes something far more sinister, a tale of revenge spanning two mysterious drownings. Only Hercule Poirot with his little grey cells can untangle the web of bitter almonds and a nurse's terrible secret. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these mystery and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see where our detective community is gathered tonight. Now, settle in with a hot cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's unfold this mystery together. The Case of the Drowning Lady, Chapter 1, An Unexpected Invitation. It was with considerable anticipation that I accompanied my friend Hercule Poirot to the coastal resort of Torquay in that particularly warm summer of 1936. After the strain of several demanding cases, Poirot had declared himself in need of complete rest and relaxation, and I confess I was equally eager for a peaceful holiday by the sea. The little grey cells, Moniro had remarked as our train pulled into the station. They require from time to time the gentle ministrations of sea air and tranquility. Our modest hotel overlooked the harbour, and I had already begun to envision pleasant days of walking along the cliff tops and evenings spent in quiet conversation over excellent dinners. However, as so often happens with the best-laid plans, ours were destined for immediate alteration. We had barely settled into our rooms when the hotel porter arrived with an envelope bearing Poirot's name in an elegant feminine hand. My friend examined the cream-coloured paper with his customary precision, his green eyes noting every detail of the writing before he slit open the envelope with his ivory paper knife. "Most interesting," he murmured, reading the contents with evident attention. "What is it, Poirot?" I inquired, observing the slight furrow that had appeared between his brows. "An invitation, Hastings, from one Lady Eleanor Faraday. She writes with considerable urgency, requesting that we abandon our hotel and accept her hospitality at her residence." He consulted the letter again. "Seaward House. She mentions having heard of our recent success in the Whitehaven bank affair." I frowned. "Rather presumptuous, isn't it? We've only just arrived. Perhaps yet there is something in the phrasing." Poirot's voice trailed off as he read the letter once more. "She writes that she has particular need of a detective's insight, and that time may be of considerable importance. Most curious, is it not?" Within the hour, we found ourselves in a hired motor car, winding our way along the coastal road towards Seaward House. The journey took us through increasingly dramatic scenery, with the Devon cliffs rising ever higher above the churning waters of the English Channel. "Good Lord!" I exclaimed as our destination came into view. "Rather an impressive pile, what?" Seaward House stood majestically upon a promontory, its grey stone walls weathered by decades of salt spray and coastal winds. The house itself was substantial, late Georgian, I judged, with tall windows that commanded a breathtaking view of the sea. Yet there was something almost forbidding about its position, perched as it was upon cliffs that dropped precipitously to the rocky shore below. Our driver, a local man with the weathered complexion of one who has spent his life by the sea, glanced back at us as we approached the imposing iron gates. "Seaward House, gentlemen," he announced, "built by old Sir Reginald Faraday back in 1823. They do say the cliffs here are treacherous. Locals call that stretch of water below the drowning shelf. On account of the way the rocks are arranged, many a ship has come to grief there, and more than one soul who ventured too close to the edge." I felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. There was something ominous in the man's words, though I could not have said precisely what. The front door of Seaward House was answered by an elderly butler whose dignified bearing spoke of years in service to a distinguished household. He ushered us into a spacious entrance hall where portraits of long dead-ad Faradays gazed down from panelled walls. "Lady Eleanor will receive you in the drawing-room, gentlemen," the butler informed us in measured tones. The drawing-room proved to be a magnificent chamber, its tall windows facing seaward and flooding the space with afternoon light. The furniture was elegant and well-maintained, though I noticed that everything was arranged with particular precision, a trait that would, I knew, appealed greatly to Poirot's sense of order. Lady Eleanor Faraday rose to greet us as we entered, and I found myself face to face with a woman of commanding presence. She appeared to be in her late 52s, with silver-grey hair arranged in an impeccable coiffure and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to take our measure in an instant. Her dress was of excellent quality, cut in a style that suggested both wealth and refined taste. "Mr. Poirot," she said, extending her hand, "how have you to come? And Captain Hastings, I presume. Your reputation precedes you both." There was something in her manner, a certain tension beneath the polished courtesy that immediately caught my attention. Lady Eleanor might present a calm exterior, but I sensed an underlying urgency that matched the tone of her letter. "We are delighted to make your acquaintance, Madame," Poirot replied with a formal bow. "Your letter suggested a matter of some importance." "Indeed," Lady Eleanor replied, though she seemed suddenly reluctant to elaborate. "But first, you must meet the other members of our household. I believe you will find them most interesting." As if, summoned by her words, footsteps could be heard approaching from the corridor beyond, and I prepared myself for what promised to be an intriguing introduction to the residents of this cliff-top mansion. The afternoon sun slanted through the great windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, and somewhere far below, the eternal sound of waves against rock provided a restless accompaniment to our arrival at Seaward House. Chapter 2. Dinner at Seaward House. The footsteps in the corridor heralded the arrival of a man who appeared to be some 15 years Lady Eleanor's junior. He entered the drawing-room with a somewhat hesitant gait, and I observed immediately that his manner lacked the natural authority one might expect from the master of such a grand establishment. "My husband, Richard Faraday," Lady Eleanor announced, though something in her tone suggested the introduction was more duty than pleasure. Richard Faraday proved to be a man of perhaps 45, with thinning fair hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to avoid direct contact with one's gaze. His handshake, when offered, was brief and rather damp, and I noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the cigarette case in his waistcoat pocket. What struck me most particularly was his habit of constantly fidgeting with papers and books, turning pages absently even when not reading, a nervous tic that seemed deeply ingrained. "Delighted to meet you, Mr. Poirot," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "Eleanor has spoken of nothing else since she decided to invite you. Quite the honor, I'm sure." Poirot acknowledged the greeting with his customary politeness, but I could see his green eyes taking careful note of the younger man's obvious nervousness and restless hands. The dinner gong sounded at 8 precisely, and we were led into a dining room that reflected the same careful attention to order and elegance as the rest of the house. The table was set for 6, and I wondered who else would be joining our party. We were not kept in suspense long. The first to arrive was a woman of perhaps 35, tall and striking, with dark hair swept back in a severe style and intelligent brown eyes that held a distinctly cool expression as they settled upon Lady Eleanor. "My stepdaughter, Miss Sylvia Marchmont," Lady Eleanor said, and I detected the slightest emphasis on the word step that spoke volumes about the relationship between the two women. "How do you do?" Miss Marchmont replied with perfect politeness, though I noted that she addressed Poirot and myself while pointedly ignoring her stepmother. "I trust you're finding Torquay to your liking, though I suppose this unexpected invitation has rather disrupted your holiday plans." Before we could respond, the door opened to admit a gentleman of middle years, whose clerical collar immediately identified his profession. Reverend Chalmers, as Lady Eleanor introduced him, was a man of perhaps 55, with a kindly face somewhat marred by an expression of perpetual anxiety. His greeting was warm enough, but I observed that his hands shook noticeably as he accepted a glass of sherry, and he seemed to start slightly whenever Lady Eleanor addressed him directly. Lady Eleanor remarked, and I caught an odd note in her voice. "The Reverend has been most generous with his time lately, so devoted to his charitable works." The final member of our dinner party arrived just as we were taking our seats. Miss Felicity Ward was introduced as a nurse who had recently joined the household as a companion to Lady Eleanor, though she appeared to be a woman of no more than 40 with competent hands and an alert, professional manner that suggested considerable experience in her field. "Miss Ward has been quite indispensable," Lady Eleanor observed, as we settled ourselves at table. "She has such a thorough knowledge of household management. One might almost think she had been here for years rather than mere weeks." I noticed that. Miss Ward received this comment with a slight smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and that she arranged her napkin and cutlery with the same methodical precision that characterized all her movements. There was something watchful about her gaze as it moved between the other diners, particularly when it rested upon Richard Faraday. The conversation during the early courses was pleasant enough, though I was conscious of undercurrents that seemed to flow just beneath the surface politeness. Sylvia Marchman made several pointed remarks about her stepmother's sudden enthusiasm for charitable causes, while Lady Eleanor responded with comments about the younger generation's inability to appreciate tradition and duty. Richard Faraday contributed little to the discussion, confining himself largely to murmured agreements and nervous gestures with his wineglass. I observed him unconsciously touching various objects throughout the meal: his napkin, the salt cellar, even the leather menu card, with the restless fingers that seemed never to be still. The Reverend, when addressed directly, seemed to start like a man awakened from unpleasant thoughts, and more than once I caught him casting anxious glances in Lady Eleanor's direction. It was during the fish course that Miss Marchman made the remark that seemed to crystallize the tension in the room. "I must say, Eleanor, your recent generosity to various causes has been quite remarkable," she said, cutting her soul with deliberate precision. "One might almost think you were attempting to purchase something, absolution perhaps." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Eleanor's face remained perfectly composed, but I observed that her knuckles whitened as she gripped her fork more tightly. "My charitable inclinations require no justification, Sylvia," she replied with icy calm, "though I suppose those who have never contributed anything to society might find such concepts difficult to understand." The remainder of the meal proceeded with the exaggerated courtesy that often follows such exchanges, but I was aware that Poirot was observing everything with his characteristic attention to detail. He made little contribution to the conversation, preferring to listen and watch, and I knew that his little grey cells were already beginning their methodical work. As we rose from table, Lady Eleanor announced her intention of taking her customary evening stroll along the cliff path, despite the lateness of the hour and the gathering darkness outside. "The seer's digestion," she explained, moving toward a small escar near the window. "I always carry my evening journal to record any thoughts that might occur during my walk." I watched as she retrieved a small leather-bound diary from the drawer, noting that it appeared freshly polished and gleamed richly in the lamplight. She tucked it carefully into her evening bag, and I observed Miss Ward's eyes following the movement with particular attention. As the other guests began to disperse to the drawing-room for coffee, I became aware of a curious scent in the air, sweet yet somehow acrid, like almonds, but with an underlying bitterness that seemed oddly out of place in the elegant surroundings. The diary itself seemed to be the source, as though the leather had been recently treated with some unfamiliar preparation. Poirot paused in the doorway, his nostrils flaring slightly, and I saw him cast a sharp glance around the room. When our eyes met, I detected a flicker of something that might have been concern, though it was gone so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. The scent, whatever its source, seemed to fade even as we noticed it, leaving only the lingering aromas of dinner and the salt tang of the sea air that drifted through the slightly opened windows. Chapter 3. Death in the Morning. I slept fitfully that night, disturbed by the constant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below, and by a vague sense of unease that I could not quite shake. The room that had been assigned to me was comfortable enough, with windows that faced inland rather than toward the treacherous coastline, but something about the atmosphere of Seaward House seemed to preclude restful sleep. It was therefore with considerable relief that I dressed and made my way downstairs for breakfast, hoping to find Poirot already in the dining room and ready to discuss our curious introduction to the Faraday household. The morning was bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows and dispelling much of the previous evening's sense of foreboding. The butler informed me that Lady Eleanor had not yet appeared for breakfast, though this was apparently not unusual. Richard Faraday sat alone at the dining table, mechanically consuming eggs and bacon while staring out toward the sea with a distracted air. His restless hands continued their constant motion, unconsciously straightening his napkin and rearranging the cutlery with nervous precision. "Good morning, Captain Hastings," he said, looking up as I entered and gesturing toward the sideboard where breakfast was laid out. "I trust you slept well. The sound of the waves can be rather disturbing to those not accustomed to it." I was about to reply when rapid footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of someone in considerable distress. The door burst open to reveal Miss Felicity Ward, her usual composed demeanor entirely shattered. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she gripped the doorframe for support. "Mr. Faraday," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must come at once. It's Lady Eleanor. There's been a terrible accident." Richard Faraday dropped his fork with a clatter, rising so abruptly that his chair overturned behind him. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his face draining of color. "Where is she?" "The Cove," Miss Ward replied, her professional training apparently struggling to reassert itself. "Benet, below the cliffs." I was taking my morning walk along the coastal path when I looked down and saw her lying on the rocks. Without another word, Richard Faraday rushed from the room, leaving me to follow in considerable alarm. We made our way through the house and out onto the cliff-top path, where a narrow track led down toward the rocky shoreline. The descent was treacherous, requiring careful attention to each step, and I marveled that anyone would attempt such a journey in darkness. Poirot was already at the scene when we arrived, having apparently been summoned by Miss Ward before she came to the house. He stood motionless beside the still form that lay sprawled among the seaweed-covered rocks, his green eyes taking in every detail with methodical precision. Lady Eleanor Faraday lay face upward, her evening gown of deep blue silk now sodden with sea otter and stained with salt. Her grey hair, so carefully arranged the previous evening, was tangled with dark fronds of seaweed, and her pale face wore an expression of peaceful repose that seemed strangely at odds with the violent circumstances of her death. One arm was stretched out toward the water, while the other lay across her chest, and her legs were positioned as though she had simply lain down to rest among the rocks. Monsieur Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the body with careful attention to avoid disturbing the scene. "The tide. It has been high during the night, n'est-ce pas?" "Aye, that it has," confirmed a gruff voice behind us. I turned to see a sturdily built man in the uniform of the local constabulary approaching along the shore. "Sergeant Morrison." He introduced himself with a touch of his cap. "Miss Ward here sent word to the station. Tragic business this, though I'm afraid we see more of it than we'd like in these parts." Richard Faraday had remained silent throughout these exchanges, staring down at his wife's body with an expression that seemed to combine grief with something else. Relief, perhaps, or bewilderment. Now he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "But what was she doing down here?" "Eleanor never walked on the rocks, especially not in the dark. She was far too sensible for such foolishness." Sergeant Morrison nodded sagely. "Aye, well, that's the way of these accidents, sir. Folks get overconfident. Or perhaps she felt faint and stumbled. These cliffs are treacherous enough in daylight. At night, with the tide coming in, they're deadly traps for the unwary." I observed Poirot's reaction to this explanation and noted the slight tightening around his eyes that usually indicated disagreement with the official view of events. He continued his examination of the scene, paying particular attention to the positioning of Lady Eleanor's evening bag, which lay some distance from the body, its contents scattered among the rocks. "The diary," I remarked, spotting the familiar leather-bound book wedged between two large stones. She had it with her. When she left for her walk, Poirot retrieved the diary with careful hands, noting that several pages had been torn out, leaving ragged edges that fluttered in the morning breeze. The leather cover was damp with sea otter, though I observed that it still retained traces of the peculiar luster I had noticed the previous evening, as though it had been recently treated with some kind of preservative or polish. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, examining the torn pages with particular attention. Among the ragged remnants, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be elegant handwriting. Not Lady Eleanor's feminine script, but something more angular and precise. "Doctor." Peton arrived shortly thereafter, an elderly gentleman with a non-nonsense manner, who had apparently served as the local physician for many years. His examination of the body was thorough but brief, and his conclusions seemed to support Sergeant Morrison's theory of accidental death. Drowning without question, he announced, rising from his examination with some difficulty, though there are no obvious signs of injury from the fall. Perhaps she fainted. Ladies of her age are sometimes prone to such episodes, particularly after exposure to certain substances or emotional distress. As the body was being prepared for removal, I noticed that Poirot had wandered some distance from the main group and was examining the cliff face with considerable attention. When I joined him, I found him studying a particular section of rock that showed signs of recent disturbance. "What is it, Poirot?" I inquired quietly. "Observe, mon ami," he replied, pointing to scuff marks on the stone surface. "These marks, they are fresh, are they not? And see here," he indicated a small piece of torn fabric caught on a projecting rock. "This silk, it matches the dress of Madame. Surely that's to be expected if she fell from above." Pooh made no immediate reply, but I could see that his mind was working along lines quite different from the official explanation of events. As we climbed back up the cliff path, leaving the tragic scene behind us, I noticed that he paused several times to examine the ground, and once he stooped to collect something that he placed carefully in his waistcoat pocket. The curious scent of bitter almonds that had so intrigued him the previous evening was entirely absent from the morning air, replaced by nothing more sinister than the salt tang of the sea and the fresh sweetness of the cliff-top grass. Whatever significance this absence held for Poirot, he kept to himself as we returned to Seaward House to break the devastating news to the remaining members of the household. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The return to Seaward House, after the tragic discovery, was a somber affair. News of Lady Eleanor's death spread through the household with the swiftness that such tidings always possess, and by the time we reached the front door, the staff had assembled in the entrance hall with expressions of shocked grief. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, dabbed at her eyes with her apron as she approached Richard Faraday with obvious distress. "Oh, sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we can hardly believe it. Her ladyship was always so careful about the cliffs. Many is the time she warned us about the dangers of walking too close to the edge, especially at night." "Yes," Richard replied absently, his restless hands working at his watch chain. "Yes, she was always most cautious about such things." Poirot, who had been listening to this exchange with his characteristic attention, stepped forward with gentle courtesy. "Madame Hartwell," he said, "you knew Lady Eleanor's habits well, n'est-ce pas? This evening walk of hers. It was a regular occurrence." "Oh, yes, sir," the cook replied, turning her tear-stained face toward him. "Every evening after dinner, rain or shine, she would take that little diary of hers and walk along the cliff path for perhaps 20 minutes. Said it helped her to think clearly about the day's events. And last evening," Poirot continued carefully, "did you observe anything unusual about her manner or behavior?" Mrs. Hartwell considered this question with evident concentration. "Well, now that you mention it, sir, she did seem rather particular about that diary yesterday afternoon. Spent considerable time in her study, she did, working on some sort of surprise. When I brought her tea, I noticed she had leather polish and wrapping paper spread about the good paper with the masculine pattern she keeps for gentlemen's gifts." I saw Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest at this detail, though he made no immediate comment. Instead, he turned his attention to the butler, who had been standing nearby with the rigid composure that years of service had taught him to maintain, even in the most trying circumstances. "And you, mon ami," Poirot addressed the elderly servant, "you have been with the family for many years." 37 years, sir," the butler replied with quiet dignity. "I served the late Sir Reginald, and after his passing I continued with Lady Eleanor. Then you would know of any recent changes in the household arrangements." A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed the butler's features before he replied. "There have been certain alterations in recent weeks, sir. Lady Eleanor made some revisions to her will, and there was considerable correspondence with her solicitors in London. She also expressed particular interest in reviewing the household accounts, which was somewhat unusual for her." Richard Faraday looked up sharply at this revelation, his nervous fingers stilling momentarily. "I knew nothing of any changes to Eleanor's will," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "Begging your pardon, sir," the butler continued with obvious reluctance. But Lady Eleanor was most specific that the matter should remain confidential until the appropriate time. Before anyone could pursue this line of inquiry further, we were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Sylvia Marchmont, who had apparently been informed of the tragedy by one of the household staff. Her composure was remarkable indeed. I found myself somewhat shocked by the apparent absence of genuine grief in her manner as she received the news of her stepmother's death. "How very unfortunate," she said, her tone carefully modulated. Though I confess I'm not entirely surprised. Eleanor always struck me as the sort of person who would eventually overestimate her own capabilities. The coldness of this remark left an uncomfortable silence in its wake, broken only when Poirot suggested that we might continue our inquiries in the village, where other perspectives on the situation might be obtained. Our walk to the village proved most illuminating. At the post office, we learned from the postmaster, a garrulous gentleman named Mr. Wickham, that Lady Eleanor had indeed been receiving a considerable amount of correspondence in recent weeks. Unusual. "Number of letters from abroad," he confided, adjusting his spectacles as he sorted through the morning's deliveries. "Switzerland, I believe, from some place called the Bernina Sanatorium, and several from London solicitors, Mess Pembroke and Associates, if memory serves." Lady Eleanor always collected her post personally, which was a bit unusual for someone of her station. "Did she seem anxious about these letters?" I inquired. "Anxious? Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that," Mr. Wickham replied thoughtfully, "but she was certainly very particular about receiving them promptly. Came in twice some days, asking if anything had arrived, and she seemed especially interested in any correspondence that might concern a Mrs. Margaret Faraday, asked me specifically to watch for any letters mentioning that name. This detail struck me as particularly significant, though I could not immediately determine why. Our next stop was the village inn, where we hoped to gather further information about the local circumstances surrounding Lady Eleanor's death. The proprietor, a stout gentleman named Mr. Aldridge, was eager to discuss the tragedy, though his information was largely limited to speculation about the dangers of the coastal path. "Terrible business," he said, shaking his head sadly. "Though between you and me, gentlemen, there's been talk in the village about some of the goings-on at Seaward House lately." "What sort of talk?" Poirot inquired with apparent casualness. "Well, nothing definite, you understand," Mr. Aldrich replied, lowering his voice confidentially. "But young Mrs. Peterson, who does the cleaning at the vicarage, mentioned that Reverend Chalmers has been most agitated lately. Apparently, he's been spending considerable time in prayer, and has been asking rather pointed questions about matters of conscience and forgiveness. This information proved even more intriguing when we encountered the Reverend himself near the village church. He appeared startled to see us, and I observed that his usual kindly manner seemed strained almost to the breaking point. "Terrible news about Lady Eleanor," he said, wringing his hands nervously. "Such a generous woman, always thinking of others. Her charitable contributions to the parish have been most substantial." "She was particularly generous recently?" Poirot asked gently. Reverend Charis shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though he feared being overheard. "Yes, indeed," he replied. "Remarkably so. She spoke often of the importance of making amends for past misunderstandings. Said she wanted to ensure that her legacy would be one of generosity rather than." He trailed off, apparently realizing he had said more than he intended. "Rather than what, Mayor?" Poirot pressed gently. "Oh, nothing specific," the Reverend replied hastily. "Just the natural concerns of someone reflecting on a long life and wishing to balance the scales, as it were. She mentioned once that she had discovered certain troubling information about someone close to her, someone whose first wife had died under circumstances that troubled her conscience." As we walked back towards Seaward House, I found myself increasingly perplexed by the various threads of information we had gathered. The picture that was emerging was of a woman who had been making significant changes to her affairs in the weeks before her death, changes that seemed to suggest either guilt about past actions or fear of future consequences. "What do you make of it all, Poirot?" I asked as we approached the imposing gates of the estate. "Most interesting, mon ami," he replied thoughtfully. "We have a lady who was making substantial changes to her will, receiving mysterious correspondence from Swiss sanatoriums and making generous donations to the church. While speaking of making amends, she was also preparing what appears to have been a gift for her husband, a gift that may have cost her life. The contradiction was indeed striking, and as we returned to the house where tragedy had so recently visited, I found myself wondering what other secrets lay hidden beneath the carefully maintained surface of this seemingly respectable household. Chapter 5. The Nurse's History. The following morning brought with it a development that was to cast an entirely new light upon our investigation. Poirot had risen early, as was his custom, and after a solitary breakfast had announced his intention of paying a visit to Dr. Piton's surgery in the village. I accompanied him, curious to learn what further insights the local physician might provide about Lady Eleanor's untimely death. Dr. Piton received us in his consulting room, a comfortable chamber lined with medical texts and warmed by a cheerful fire. He was a man of perhaps 65, with the brisk, non-nonsense manner that comes from years of dealing with the ailments and anxieties of a rural practice. Tragic business, this affair at Seaward House, he began without preamble. Though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised. Lady Eleanor had been under considerable strain lately. Nothing specific, you understand, but the sort of nervous tension that sometimes afflicts ladies of her age and station. You had been treating her recently? Poirot inquired. Not treating precisely, Doctor, Piton replied, settling back in his chair. But she had consulted me several times in the past month about matters of general health, sleep difficulties primarily, and what she described as episodes of anxiety. She mentioned being disturbed by certain revelations about people close to her. And Miss Ward, Poirot continued with apparent casualness. You were acquainted with her professional credentials before she joined the household, Doctor. Piton's expression shifted slightly, and I detected a note of discomfort in his reply. Miss Ward presented excellent references, he said carefully. Her training was exemplary, and her experience in private nursing was extensive. She had worked in some of the finest establishments in Switzerland. Switzerland! Pooh's eyebrows rose with interest. How curious. And these establishments, you verified her employment with them? Well, not directly, the doctor admitted with obvious reluctance. But her references were signed by Dr. Hans Müller of the Bernina Sanatorium, a most reputable institution. Miss Ward had been employed there as a private nurse to several distinguished patients. I saw Poirot's green eyes sharpen with sudden attention. And among these patients, he said quietly, was there perhaps a Mrs. Margaret Faraday? Dr. Piton started violently, nearly knocking over the inkwell on his desk. Good heavens, he exclaimed. How did you? Yes, indeed. Margaret Faraday was mentioned prominently in the references. Miss Ward had been her personal nurse during the final months of her illness, a most devoted attendant by all accounts. And the nature of Mrs. Margaret Faraday's death? Poirot pressed gently. Drown, Dr. Piton replied in a voice barely above a whisper. She fell from a balcony at the sanatorium into the lake below. A terrible accident, or so the Swiss authorities concluded, though there were certain irregularities that troubled some of the staff. Irregularities? Margaret had always been terrified of heights. The doctor explained reluctantly. It seemed most unusual for her to venture onto a high balcony, particularly at night, and the inheritance arrangements were completed with remarkable speed. Her husband inherited everything within a matter of weeks. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air between us. Here was a connection that seemed far too significant to be mere coincidence. Miss Ward had been present at the death of Richard Faraday's first wife, just as she had been present at Seaward House when his second wife met her end. After taking our leave of Dr. Piton, we returned to Seaward House with this startling information weighing upon our minds. Poirot's manner had become increasingly prosoport, thoughtful, and I could see that his little grey cells were working with their customary precision to fit this new piece into the complex puzzle that Lady Eleanor's death had presented. We found Miss Ward in the morning room, engaged in what appeared to be routine correspondence. She looked up as we entered, her professional composure intact, though I fancied I detected a slight tension in her manner that had not been present during our previous encounters. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, setting aside her pen with deliberate care. I trust you are making progress in your inquiries. Poor Lady Eleanor deserves to have the circumstances of her death properly understood." "Indeed," Poirot replied, taking a seat across from her with his characteristic precision. "And it is in that spirit that I must ask you some questions about your previous employment, mademoiselle." Miss Ward's hands stilled completely, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Certainly," she said, "though I'm not sure how my past positions could be relevant to Lady Eleanor's accident." "Your work in Switzerland," Poirot continued gently. "At the Bernina Sanatorium, you were employed as a private nurse to Mrs. Margaret Faraday, were you not?" The effect of this question was immediate and dramatic. Miss Ward's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure, and for a moment her professional mask slipped entirely. I saw pain, guilt, and something else. Was it fear flash across her features before she regained control? "Yes," she said quietly. "I was Margaret's nurse during her final illness. It was a most difficult period. She died by drowning, I believe." "Yes." Miss Ward's voice had become barely audible. "She fell from her room's balcony into the lake. It was ruled an accidental death." "And you," Poirot said with infinite gentleness, "you cared deeply for Mrs. Margaret Faraday, did you not?" The question seemed to strike Miss Ward like a physical blow. Her hands began to tremble, and when she looked up at Poirot, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Margaret she was, a remarkable woman," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Kind, intelligent, full of life despite her illness. She deserved so much better than to die afraid and alone on that terrible night." "And her husband?" Poirot asked quietly. "Mr. Richard Faraday. You formed certain opinions about him during your time at the sanatorium." The transformation in Miss Ward's expression was startling. The grief and vulnerability of moments before were replaced by something much harder and more dangerous. "Richard Faraday," she said, and there was no mistaking the venom in her voice, "is a man who destroys everything beautiful that comes into his life. I watched him for months, his constant handling of papers and personal items, his nervous energy that wore Margaret down day by day. When she died, he showed more interest in the inheritance paperwork than in her funeral arrangements. The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound. Miss Ward seemed to realize that she had revealed far more than she had intended, and her professional mask slipped back into place with visible effort. "I'm sorry," she said, rising from her chair with abrupt movement. "I'm afraid the recent tragedy has affected me more deeply than I realized. If you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." She left the room with swift, purposeful strides, leaving Poirot and me to contemplate the extraordinary scene we had just witnessed. The revelation of Miss Ward's connection to Richard Faraday's first wife, combined with her obvious emotional involvement in that tragic case, had opened up entirely new possibilities in our investigation. As we sat in the quiet morning room, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of the sea, a constant murmur in the distance, I found myself wondering how many more secrets lay hidden within the walls of Seaward House, and what role the enigmatic Miss Ward had truly played in the deaths of two Mrs. Faradays. Chapter 6. The Poison in the Pages. The revelations concerning Miss Ward's previous connection to the Faraday family had left me considerably shaken, but Poirot appeared to regard this development with the satisfaction of a man who sees a complex puzzle beginning to reveal its underlying pattern. He spent the remainder of that afternoon in what he termed reflection, pacing the confines of his room with the methodical precision that always characterized his periods of intense mental activity. It was not until the following morning that he announced his intention to pursue what he described as a most crucial line of inquiry. This involved a journey to the neighboring town of Paynton, where Professor Littledale maintained a small but well-equipped laboratory that served the needs of the local medical and legal communities. The diary Monomiro explained as we settled ourselves in the hired motor car. There are certain tests that must be performed upon it, tests that may reveal truths more significant than any confession. Professor Littledale proved to be an elderly gentleman of scientific bent with steel-rimmed spectacles and the sort of precise manner that comes from years of dealing with chemical formulas and microscopic evidence. He received us in his laboratory, a spotless chamber filled with gleaming apparatus and the sharp sense of various reagents. "Ah, Mr. Poirot," he said, extending a thin hand in greeting. "Doctor, A Piton telephoned to say you might be calling something about chemical analysis. I believe Poirot produced Lady Eleanor's diary from his coat pocket, handling it with the careful attention he always paid to potentially crucial evidence. "This book, Professor," he said, placing it carefully upon the examination table. "I have reason to believe it may have been treated with some substance of a toxic nature. The leather cover in particular requires most careful scrutiny." Professor Littledale adjusted his spectacles and bent to examine the diary with obvious interest. "Curious," he murmured, noting the slight discoloration along the edges of the cover. "There does appear to be some form of residue present. If you would be so good as to wait in the ante-room, gentlemen, I shall conduct the necessary tests." The wait that followed seemed interminable. I found myself pacing the small ante-room much as Poirot had paced his bedroom the previous day, while my friend sat in motionless contemplation, his green eyes fixed upon some distant point, as though he were visualizing the sequence of events that had led to Lady Eleanor's death. When Professor Littledale finally emerged from his laboratory, his expression was grave, and his manner had acquired a solemnity that had been absent during our initial meeting. "Most extraordinary," he announced without preamble. "The leather cover of this diary has been treated with a solution containing a remarkably high concentration of potassium cyanide. The chemical has been absorbed into the material itself, making it virtually undetectable, except through specialized testing." I felt the blood drain from my face at this confirmation of what I now realized had been Poirot's suspicions from the very beginning. "The method of application?" Poirot inquired with professional interest. "A polish or conditioning treatment, I should judge," Professor Littledale replied, "applied evenly across the surface and allowed to dry. Anyone handling the diary would absorb the poison through the skin of their hands, a slow but ultimately fatal process, though at this concentration death would occur within hours rather than days. And the quantity present would be sufficient to cause death. Without question, the concentration is remarkably high. Whoever prepared this intended to ensure there would be no possibility of survival. Most disturbing is that this appears to have been applied over an existing layer of ordinary leather polish, suggesting careful premeditation. As we made our way back to Seaward House, I found myself struggling to comprehend the full implications of this discovery. The diary had been deliberately poisoned by someone who knew of Lady Eleanor's habit of carrying it during her evening walks. The killer had counted on the poison taking effect while she was alone on the cliff path, making her death appear to be the result of a tragic accident. "But Poirot," I said as our motor car navigated the winding coastal road, "if the diary was poisoned deliberately, then surely this confirms that Lady Eleanor was the intended victim." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "You assume too much. Consider, what if the diary was never intended for Lady Eleanor at all? What if she became involved quite by accident in a plan designed for another?" This suggestion opened up entirely new possibilities, and I found myself reconsidering everything we had learned about the events of that fatal evening. Had Lady Eleanor somehow intercepted a gift meant for someone else? If so, who had been the intended victim? Upon our return to Seaward House, Poirot immediately requested permission to examine Lady Eleanor's private study more thoroughly. Richard Faraday, who appeared increasingly haggarded with each passing day, granted this request with the weary acquiescence of a man who had ceased to care about the niceties of privacy and propriety. The study proved to be a room that reflected its late owner's character, orderly, elegant, and furnished with the sort of careful attention to detail that spoke of a naturally methodical mind. Poirot examined the contents of the desk with his usual thoroughness, paying particular attention to recent correspondence and any evidence of gift-giving or social obligations. It was in the bottom drawer of the escritoire that he made his most significant discovery. A bottle of leather conditioning polish recently purchased, according to the receipt, tucked beneath it, and a roll of decorative wrapping paper in a masculine pattern of deep blue and gold. "Observe, Hastings," he said, holding up these items for my inspection. "The polish matches exactly the treatment applied to the diary cover and this wrapping paper. It is clearly intended for a gentleman's gift, Neskispa." Before I could reply, we were interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. Miss Ward entered, her professional composure intact, but with something in her manner that suggested considerable internal agitation. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "but I noticed you examining Lady Eleanor's personal effects. I wondered if there was anything specific you were looking for. I was, after all, familiar with her daily routines, and might be able to assist your search." Poirot regarded her with a steady gaze that always seemed to penetrate beneath the surface of conventional politeness. "You are most kind, mademoiselle," he replied. "But tell me, did Lady Eleanor often give gifts to other members of the household? Personal items, perhaps, such as books or writing materials?" Miss Ward's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable, a slight tightening around her eyes, and a barely perceptible hesitation before she answered. "She was generous with the staff at Christmas and on special occasions," she said carefully, "though I cannot recall any recent gifts of the sort you describe." "And you yourself," Poirot continued with apparent casualness, "did you perhaps suggest any particular gifts that might be appropriate for Mr. Richard Faraday? A gentleman's diary, for instance, given his habit of constantly handling papers and books." The effect of this question was immediate and dramatic. Miss Ward's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely, and for a moment her face revealed a mixture of fear, guilt, and something that looked remarkably like relief at finally being confronted with the truth. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but even as she spoke, I could see that she realized the futility of further deception. Among the scattered papers on the desk, Poirot's keen eyes had noticed something that had escaped my attention, a small piece of writing paper bearing the beginning of an inscription in Miss Ward's precise handwriting, "To Richard, with hopes for new beginnings." The sentence was unfinished, as though the writer had been interrupted, but the intent was unmistakable. Poirot moved to the window and stood looking out toward the treacherous coastline, where two women had now met their deaths under suspiciously similar circumstances. The afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair and highlighted the stern set of his features as he contemplated the evidence that was finally beginning to form a complete and damning picture. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. The evening of our discovery in Lady Eleanor's study brought with it a change in the weather that seemed to mirror the darkening atmosphere. Within Seaward House itself, storm clouds had been gathering over the channel throughout the afternoon, and by the time we assembled for dinner, the first drops of rain were beginning to lash against the tall windows that overlooked the treacherous coastline. Poirot had spent much of the day in what he termed final preparation, and I observed that his manner had acquired the particular intensity that always preceded his dramatic revelations. He had spoken little of his conclusions, but I could see that the pieces of the puzzle had finally arranged themselves into a complete picture within his methodical mind. "Tonight, mon ami," he had said as we dressed for dinner, "we shall gather all the interested parties and bring this tragic affair to its inevitable conclusion." The announcement that Poirot wished to address the household had been received with varying degrees of apprehension by the remaining members of our small company. Richard Faraday had grown increasingly pale and nervous as the day progressed, his restless hands working constantly at his watch chain and cufflinks, while Miss Sylvia Marchmont maintained her usual air of cold composure, though I detected an underlying tension in her manner that suggested she was not as indifferent to the proceedings as she wished to appear. Miss Ward had said little since our confrontation in the study, but her professional demeanor had acquired a brittle quality that reminded me of glass under extreme pressure, clear to shatter at the slightest additional strain. Reverend Charmer had been summoned from the village and sat fidgeting with his prayer book, his kindly face creased with anxiety. Sergeant Morrison and Dr. Peton had also been invited to attend, lending an official gravity to the proceedings that served to heighten the tension already present in the drawing-room. The storm outside provided a dramatic backdrop to our gathering, with lightning illuminating the turbulent waters of the cove where Lady Eleanor had met her death. Poirot had arranged the seating with his characteristic attention to detail, positioning himself near the fireplace where the light would illuminate his features as he spoke. The evidence, Lady Eleanor's diary, the bottle of leather polish, the wrapping paper, and the unfinished inscription, was arranged on a side table within easy reach. "Madame de Mesure," he began his accented English, carrying clearly despite the sound of wind and rain against the windows. "We are gathered here tonight to discuss the death of Lady Eleanor Faraday. which occurred 3 days ago in the cove below these cliffs. Richard Faraday shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his nervous fingers drumming silently against the armrest, while Miss Ward sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap with professional precision. The official conclusion, Poirot continued, was that Madame died as the result of a tragic accident, that she fell from the cliff path during her customary evening walk and subsequently drowned in the incoming tide. "Surely that's exactly what happened," Richard interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. "Eleanor was always careful, but the path can be treacherous in darkness." "Ah, monsieur," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "But that explanation, it does not account for certain curious facts that have come to light during our investigation." He moved to the side table and picked up Lady Eleanor's diary, handling it with careful attention. This diary, for instance, Lady Eleanor carried it with her on her final walk, yet, when it was discovered, several pages had been torn from it. Why would a lady tear pages from her personal journal during a leisurely evening stroll? Sylvia Marchman leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. "Perhaps she wrote something she later regretted," she suggested. "Eleanor was always rather particular about maintaining proper appearances." "A possibility," Poirot acknowledged. "But consider also this curious fact. The diary itself had been recently treated with leather conditioning polish, most unusual attention to pay to an item that would spend its evening exposed to salt air and dampness." I observed that Miss Ward's hands had begun to tremble slightly, though she maintained her outward composure. "Furthermore," Poirot continued, beginning to pace before the fireplace with his characteristic measured steps, "we have learned that Lady Eleanor had recently made significant changes to her will, changes that would substantially benefit her current husband while effectively disinheriting her stepdaughter." "Is that supposed to surprise anyone?" Sylvia asked, with bitter amusement. "Eleanor always was susceptible to younger men with charming manners." Richard Faraday flushed deeply at this remark, but remained silent, his hands now trembling noticeably as they worked at his collar. "We have also discovered," Poirot went on, "that Lady Eleanor had been in correspondence with parties in Switzerland, specifically the Bernina Sanatorium, and that she had been making unusually generous donations to the local church, while speaking of the need to make amends for past actions." Reverend Charas started nervously at this reference, his prayer book slipping from his fingers. "But perhaps most significant of all," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "we have learned that Miss Felicity Ward was previously employed as a private nurse in Switzerland, where she attended another Mrs. Faraday, the first wife of our host, who also died by drowning under circumstances that were ruled accidental." The effect of this revelation was electric. Richard Faraday half rose from his chair, his face white with shock, while Miss Ward remained frozen in her seat, her professional mask finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence. "Two Mrs. Faradays," Poirot continued inexorably, "both attended by the same nurse, both dead by drowning in circumstances that aroused no official suspicion. A remarkable coincidence, is it not?" The storm outside seemed to intensify as he spoke, with thunder rolling across the channel and rain drumming against the windows with increasing violence. The atmosphere in the drawing-room had become charged with tension, and I could see that several members of our audience were beginning to realize that this was not merely an academic discussion of the evidence, but the prelude to an accusation of murder. Dr. Petton cleared his throat nervously. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Poirot, that Lady Eleanor's death was not accidental?" "I am stating, monsieur, that Lady Eleanor Faraday was murdered," Poirot replied with quiet certainty. "Murdered by means of a poison that was applied to the leather cover of her diary. A poison that would be absorbed through the skin of her hands as she carried the book during her evening walk." The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the sound of the storm and Miss Ward's sharp intake of breath. In the flickering light of the fire and the occasional flash of lightning from outside, the assembled company sat frozen like figures in a tableau, waiting for Poirot to reveal the identity of the killer who sat among them. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The silence that followed Poirot's dramatic announcement stretched for what seemed an eternity, broken only by the relentless sound of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder from the storm-tossed channel beyond. In the flickering light of the fire, every face in the drawing-room reflected a different aspect of shock, fear, or guilty knowledge. It was Richard Faraday who finally broke the spell, his voice barely above a whisper. Murder. But surely, who would want to harm Ella Lenina, and why? Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon the assembled company, his green eyes moving from face to face with methodical precision before settling upon Miss Felicity Ward, who sat rigid in her chair, her professional composure finally beginning to crumble under the weight of his scrutiny. The answer to both questions, Monsieur, he said quietly, lies with Miss Ward. But to understand her actions, we must first understand her true relationship with your first wife, Margaret. Miss Ward's hands clenched in her lap, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the windows, where lightning continued to illuminate the treacherous coastline. Miss Ward was not merely Margaret Faraday's nurse, Poirot continued with gentle but inexorable precision. She was Margaret's devoted companion. Indeed, I believe the term beloved would be more accurate. The death of Margaret in that Swiss sanatorium was not merely the loss of a patient for Miss Ward. It was the destruction of her entire world. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Richard Faraday's face went white as comprehension dawned, while Sylvia Marchmont leaned forward with sudden avid interest. And Miss Ward believed, Poirot went on, that Margaret's death was not the accident it appeared to be. She suspected that you, Mr. Faraday, had somehow contrived your first wife's drowning, a woman terrified of heights, who somehow fell from a high balcony in order to inherit her considerable fortune and free yourself to pursue other interests. That's preposterous, Richard protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Margaret's death was a tragic accident. The Swiss authorities conducted a thorough investigation. Indeed, they did, Poirot agreed, and they found no evidence of foul play. But Miss Ward's grief and suspicion festered over the months that followed. When she learned of your remarriage to Lady Ella Lenina, she conceived a plan for revenge, a plan that would make you suffer, as she believed you had made Margaret suffer. Miss Ward finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. Margaret, was everything good and pure in this world? She said, her eyes fixed upon Richard with undisguised hatred. She loved you completely, trusted you absolutely, and you destroyed her for money. Money you then used to charm another wealthy widow into marriage. So you came to Seaward House, Poirot continued ostensibly, as Lady Ella Lenina's companion, but in reality, to execute your revenge. You studied the household routines, observed Mr. Faraday's nervous habit of constantly handling books and papers, and you prepared your weapon, a leather diary treated with potassium cyanide. Dr. Peton gasped audibly at this technical detail while Sergeant Morrison leaned forward with professional interest. But here, Mademoiselle, is where your plan went tragically wrong, Poirot said, his voice heavy with genuine sadness. The poisoned diary was never intended for Lady Eleanor at all. It was meant as a gift for Richard Faraday himself, a gift that would slowly kill him through repeated handling. The assembled company turned to stare at Miss Ward, who had begun to sob quietly, her professional mask finally abandoned entirely. You purchased the leather polish. You prepared the wrapping paper in masculine colors, and you wrote the inscription to Richard with hopes for new beginnings, Poirot explained. You planned to present the diary to Mr. Faraday as a thoughtful gift from his wife, knowing his constant habit of handling books and papers would ensure the poison's absorption. But Lady Eleanor discovered the diary before you could present it, I interjected, finally understanding the cruel irony of the situation. Precisely, mon ami, Poirot confirmed. Lady Eleanor, in her methodical way, had decided to organize some surprise gifts for her husband. She found the diary, assumed it was one of her own purchases that needed preparation, and polished the cover herself, adding her own treatment over the deadly poison that Miss Ward had already applied. Miss Ward looked up through her tears, her voice breaking as she spoke. I never meant for Eleanor to die, she whispered. When I realized what had happened, I tried to remove the evidence, tore out the pages with my inscription, but it was too late. I had killed an innocent woman in my quest for justice against the man who murdered Margaret. Richard Faraday had sunk into his chair, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. Margaret's death was an accident, he said weakly. I loved her. I would never have harmed her. Perhaps, Poirot replied with characteristic diplomacy. But Miss Ward's grief and her need for vengeance made her see guilt where there may have been only tragedy. She observed your nervous habits for weeks, planning the perfect method of slow poisoning. In seeking to punish you for a crime you may not have committed, she became guilty of the very crime she imagined you had perpetrated. Sergeant Morrison rose from his chair with obvious reluctance. Miss Felicity Ward, he said formally, I must arrest you for the murder of Lady Eleanor Faraday. Miss Ward offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied, her confession having drained her of all fight. As she was led from the drawing-room, she paused to look back at Richard Faraday one final time. You may not have killed Margaret with your own hands, she said quietly, but your indifference, your constant nervous energy that wore her down, your inability to love anyone but yourself, these things destroyed her as surely as poison or a push from a balcony. The storm outside had begun to abate as Miss Ward was taken away, though the sound of waves against the rocks below continued its eternal rhythm. The assembled company dispersed gradually, each lost in private thoughts about the tragic events that had unfolded within the walls of Seaward House. As Poirot and I stood at the great windows, looking out over the now calm waters of the cove, where Lady Eleanor had met her untimely end, my friend spoke quietly of the case's resolution. In murder, mon ami, he said with philosophical sadness, the hand that strikes often misses its intended heart, yet still leaves death in its wake. Miss Ward sought justice for one she loved, but her grief blinded her to the difference between suspicion and proof, between perceived wrong and actual guilt. The lighthouse beam swept across the water as we watched its steady pulse, a reminder that even in the darkest waters there are those who seek to guide ships safely home. But for Lady Eleanor Faraday and for the tormented woman whose quest for vengeance had led to her destruction, that guiding light had come too late. In the end, the pursuit of justice had become the very injustice it sought to remedy, leaving only tragedy in its wake. Thank you for joining us for the case of the drowning lady. Did you suspect Miss Ward's true plan before Poirot revealed the tragic mistake? Tell us in the comments. If you liked this mystery, please subscribe to Whispers of the Night and consider joining our membership for ad-free listening and exclusive tales. Until next time, this is Adam signing off from Whispers of the Night.